minds. That was it. It just blew his mind. He says, he goes on to say, you've helped to kill God knows how many thousands of people without even knowing it. Now, it turns out that he's, Keith Richards has a way of, has a particular way with words, but round and about, he's right. It's actually true.
But Matthew, you know what's interesting though is that so many people, the question is, were the Beatles, were the Stones, were they complicit in this brainwashing, mind control, culture control, or were they naive? And I guess this shows that they were naive, right? This quote.
It's the $1 million question, isn't it? It would suggest, if you read into that quote from Keith Richards, that they were naive. Yeah. But then again, to play devil's advocate, someone who's listening to this might say, that's part of the conspiracy. They're just playing naive,
Right.
They're just playing with your head and trying to play chess with your head, so...
Well, then you'll have the group that says you and me are in on it too, so it never ends.
Yeah, exactly. They're bluffing you. They're double bluffing you or something like that. Yeah. So when you start thinking like that, your head goes crazy, doesn't it? Well, mine does, so I try not to. But he's absolutely right. Like I say, he's Keith Richards has got a way with words, his own particular way of saying things. But he's right. During the Vietnam War, Decca Records was, part of Decca Records, or what you would call the Decca Navigator Company, which was part of Decca, was supplying radar to the US forces in Vietnam. And not only was it supply, and I think they were put into their helicopters. They were radar systems that Decca built and manufactured, and they were placed into the actual helicopters, if I'm not mistaken. And I think what Decca was also doing, it was training US troops, who in turn would then go on to train other troops in how to use this radar. How Decca got into this initially, you have to go back to the Second World War. When Decca actually started, I think they were called the Decca Graphophone Company. They started in Britain, as I mentioned earlier. I think that was sometime in the 1930s, if I'm not mistaken. I can't quite remember when it was. It was in the 1910s, I think it was, when they started as the Decca Graphophone Company. And basically, what the Decca Graphophone Company was, it was a company that made what you would now call stereo equipment, music equipment. So they made graphophone players, equipment that you could play music on. So Decca didn't actually start in business to actually make music. It started in business to make the equipment that you played music on. And it wasn't until the late 1920s when a gentleman, an English stockbroker by the name of Edward Lewis, got involved with Decca, that they then started to branch out into music. And I think it was Edward Lewis who spearheaded this. I think, to paraphrase the guy, what he said was, hey, look here, hey, look, guys, we're missing out on a trick here in terms of money. We can actually, instead of just making the equipment to play the music on, we should actually be making the music as well to go with it. So from the 1930s, I think it was, Decca Records as a label actually began, and I think some of the artists that appeared on there during the 30s and 40s include Judy Garland. I think Louis Armstrong was another one. How they got into radar, it was through a gentleman by the name of, his name escapes me now, I think it was Harvey Schwartz, who was a sound engineer at Decca. And it was sometime in the late 1930s or mid-1930s that Harvey Schwartz suggested that perhaps what Decca should be getting into is radar, which at the time, if I'm not mistaken, I think at the time radar was still in its infant phase. I think that radar at that time was still a very new thing. It was still something that was being developed. It hadn't sort of come of age as it was. So what Harvey Schwartz suggested, this sound engineer at Decca, what he suggested is that Decca should get into this field of research and start to see if it could get into radar and start to manufacture it. And what they came up with was the Decca navigator system. And this was actually used in the D-Day landings by the Allied forces, the invasion of Normandy, wasn't it, in France in 1944. And I have come across, according to some of the research that I've come across, some of the findings I've come across, some of the data, that the D-Day landings, the success of the D-Day landings was thanks in large part to the Decca navigator system, which was used, the radar system that was used thanks to Decca. It was thanks to that that there was this success with the D-Day mission of 1944. And then what happened after that, after the war ended in 1945, the Decca navigator system, thanks to the success of that, then became the Decca Navigator Company, which is what I mentioned earlier. So Decca then went into full business in the manufacture and the production and the research into radar as well. So
yeah, it's fascinating. Even in Vietnam, they had patches. The soldiers wore patches. Vietnam 16 Single Company, Decca Pocket Patch. So they were heavily involved in the Vietnam War. Let me ask you, moving on. You have these fascinating pictures of a studio that was built in the 50s in America, the Decca Records, with this incredible architecture. What can you tell us about that? The photos are on the article. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I don't know too much about it. What you'll find on the article is what I've kind of written about it is what I've basically found. I haven't left anything out at all. It's a building that housed the American branch of Decca Records, because Decca did branch out across the world, and the American branch of Decca Records had this building in New York, which was used. I think it was his offices in New York, like its headquarters, if you like, but it also had recording facilities in there, and it was part of. I think it was a hotel, but it was called the Pythian Temple Building, and it belonged to the Knights of Pythian, the Knights of Pythia, a fraternal order. And yeah, if you go take a look at my article on Conspiro Media, if you go take a look at this article with the information of which I've been talking about, you'll see that and as you say, I've put some pictures of this Pythian temple building on there. And how can I describe it? Well, it's very Masonic looking. It's it's upside down triangles, Egyptian kind of statues. I think I've got a quote on the website. I'm actually looking at the article now, and there's a quote here. It's been described as a blockbuster synthesis of Egyptian, Babylonian, and Assyrian motifs. That's how the building is described. And yeah, I mean, if you go take a look, as I say, it's very Egyptian looking, very, very Masonic looking. And the building belonged to the Knights of Pythia, a fraternal order, as I say. And it's like, I think it was a hotel.
What I found fascinating was that Buddy Holly would record there, Bill Haley and the Comets, and Rock Around the Clock, which is considered to be the first rock and roll song. The birth of rock and roll was in this Masonic temple. This Pythian joint, And Buddy Holly died. Buddy Holly died. Plane, a suspicious plane crash, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a hotel building. The thing is, I don't know if the Knights of Pythia were actually using it as a hotel, or they bought it when it was a hotel, and they just bought it as a going interest and then just closed the hotel down. But I think, like you say, Rock Around the Clock, Bill Haley and his Comets, I think was recorded. I think one of the recording studios, or the recording studio, was actually in the ballroom. Right. Or Rock Around the Clock was recorded in the ballroom section, or what would have been used as the ballroom in this hotel or ex-hotel or whatever it was. But in this building, it was recorded in that particular part of the building. And yeah, you say suspicious air crash. I mean, I have yet to look into the Buddy Holly air crash, but I have read rumours and claims. I don't know what you know about this, but there was some kind of insurance kind of scam going on with the crash.
I know there's an expert on the crash that goes around and does interviews. I never took down his information to contact him myself, and he has very elaborate theories. So let's move on to EMI, though, the company that launched the Beatles.
Yes, so you got EMI, again, another British company. And it's actually, EMI got into radar right in the beginning. I think it actually it was the RDF2 radar, the first ever airborne radar to be made and to be used. That's an EMI production, and I think that was just prior to the Second World War, or just as it started. I can't quite remember, but it was sometime around there. But if you look at the invention of stereo sound, which of course now is, it's everywhere. It's part of our lives. When we watch or listen to anything, it's stereo sound. There it is. It's part of our everyday life, part of the mainstream. Hardly think about it. But it was actually invented by EMI, if you like. It's an EMI invention, thanks to an individual by the name of Blumlein. His surname was Blumlein. Again, another sound engineer. He was a sound engineer at EMI in the 1930s, a British guy. I can't remember his first name. I think it was Alan Blumlein. Yes, it was Alan D. Blumlein was his actual name, and he's one of these people that you would call not a mad genius, but he was one of these genius type figures, an inventor, a sound engineer and an inventor, an electrics expert, good at electronics. And he's the guy that's actually, whilst he was working for EMI, he's the guy that's actually credited with inventing stereo sound, or as he called it. He used to call it binaural sound. And how he came to the story that we're given on how he came to invent or think of the concept for stereo was what happened was one evening he went to a movie theatre in the 1930s with his wife, and he was watching a movie. And as he was watching the movie, it came to his realization that the sounds that he was getting from the speakers didn't really represent what should be coming from the speakers in terms the way he saw it was the speaker should, in theory, represent what the human ear hears. But but back then in the 1930s, loudspeakers, the loudspeakers back then didn't really represent what the human ear, how the human ear picks up sound. So, for example, he was watching this movie, just kind of paraphrasing the story, kind of how he would have thought of it. He was watching this movie, and there's a guy on the screen. He's moving from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, and he's talking while he's walking. In theory, as he's walking from left to right, the sound in your ear, the sound that should be coming from the speaker should be going from left to right. But of course, as it would with the human ear. But of course, it wasn't. It was all coming all at once from the speaker. It was all just coming in one block. And it was then that he thought that if there was that it came to his realization that there should be some kind of way that the loudspeaker should be able to do this, that it should be able to represent what the human ear hears. So that's where he got the idea for stereo. So he ran away with this idea, began to develop it. Stereo sound didn't actually go into the marketplace in terms of music, not in a huge mass mainstream way until about the 1950s. That's when stereo sound was really, when it really burst onto the scene on records, on vinyl, radio, whatever. Where it actually made its debut was in a military setting. And this was largely thanks to the Royal Air Force, the RAF, during the Second World War. What was happening was, during the Second World War, now, thanks, as I